It's really good to be here after 50 years. The last time we met, well, we did meet in between, but yes, it's good. I complained when Nigat, for the rare time I'm calling you Nigat, called and called and said कि आओ कुछ बोलो, and I complained. I said क्या बदला है between 1995 and today? I don't see a lot of change. We do the same Rona Dhona every time we meet, and frankly I'm tired of doing Rona Dhona. So, but it seems one has to do it. And I also looked at how things have changed, aside from the fact that some of us were talking about how we've put on more weight, we have more wrinkles. किसी के बाल सफेद हो गए हैं, कोई ज़्यादा डाई लगाने लगी हैं. तो ये चेंजेस हुए हैं. इसके अलावा और क्या हुए? हम वही मिलिट्राइजेशन को कोस रहे हैं, हम उसी नेशनलिज्म को क्वेश्चन कर रहे हैं. तो रियली उस हवाले से क्या तब्दीली आई है? एंड आई फेल्ट कि आई है, कुछ तब्दीलियाँ आई हैं. I thought back to sort of what we used to use, standard sort of text, the South Asian Feminist Declaration from Bangalore, 1989. If you read that today, it is as relevant as it was 20 years ago, and it's available on the internet, by the way. Which said the notion of national interests becomes a ready rationale for governments in our countries to increase their level of militarization. National and religious chauvinism built on mutual hostility becomes the binding force to maintain the nation state. It goes on to question different constructions, ideologies, the rise of right-wing ideologies to oppress women. And in that sense, it appears that not much has changed, and in fact, these trends have intensified. And I think we need to talk about the intensification of these trends and how to handle those trends, the intensification. Because the handling definitely needs to be very different to what we thought it needed to be 15 years ago. So yes, we made connections. Even in 1994, I remember ASR had organized sort of a Beijing, run up to Beijing conference, I can't remember the name. And I remember problematizing militarization then, talking about the Afghan jihad then, and how that intensified militarization in Pakistan, the al-Haq regime, so on and so forth, how that was, how women suffered in terms of discriminatory legislation, the acceptance and naturalization of violence against all powerless groups, minorities, and so on. How have those trends changed, and in what direction is the point that I think we need to raise. My second point is that I'm not going to try and connect specific conflicts within Pakistan and South Asia. I'm not specifically going to talk about Kashmir, Balochistan, Sindh, what happened in Karachi. These are ethnic conflicts, sectarian conflicts, so on and so forth, because it would be very difficult, and we all know about these conflicts. Frankly, we know the issues, and I'm just tired of saying them over and over again. I see Tyra smiling. What one is concerned with is the internal and external conflicts have continuities, not only in terms of the contemporary context, but in terms of historical depth. So these are not new conflicts that we are seeing, although the forms are new. The conflicts are really old, and it's the present day states, especially in South Asia, if we are talking about interstate conflicts, these did not exist in their present form before 47, I would say, just broadly speaking. So many of the conflicts have roots pre-47, and so the whole notion of boundaries of the state and so on, statehood, nationhood, become very, very problematic, not just from feminist perspectives, but even from other perspectives of understanding conflict. Some people do believe, and I'm part of that group, that feels that there is a problem with the structure of the state. And this is sort of, again, the standard logic reasoning that states as part of, post, especially third world states, post-World War II were established on Western models based on nationalism. The state has then tried to forge a nation and a unitary identity, and that is where the problem lies vis-a-vis conflict. As it tries to forge that national identity, ethnic, religious identities have been suppressed, or any other identity that may challenge the notion of nationhood has been suppressed violently, and that is where internal and external conflicts come into play. Now, to take these 2 points further, the bit about historical continuities, for me the best example, although I've said I'm not going to speak about specific conflicts or their analysis, but what I want to bring forth is to use a few conflicts to demonstrate the larger conceptual points I'm trying to make. The old conflicts, for instance, if we look at the war on terror, which is really the new part of what we are dealing with today in our contexts, in the tribal areas, it is really old conflicts that continue to this day. So when in 2001, President Bush declared, I think we agree the past is over, and by saying this, he declared the past dead and irrelevant. What he meant was the Cold War was over and the new war on terror meant different dynamics. But for us, this defining moment in history is really not a new moment and there's no dead past. For us, it has been a continuity of the past. For the rest of the world, it may be new. For us, it continues from the old Cold War stuff, from the British imperialism, from our colonial past. And that is what I mean when I say we need to understand conflicts both in terms of historical depth as well as contemporary issues of intensification and changes in form. 9/11 has not taken place in isolation, without history, without politics, although we have started to look at the world differently. And in that sense, the internal conflict and external conflict have a connection here. We have faced the problems that we face, but the new context of the problem is that the liberal states that we used to love to critique back in 1995, today we are worried about that state. The liberal state that we hated, now we wanted to survive the Taliban onslaught. That is the new context of conflict for us. Do we have choices? And if so, how can we best exercise them in an age of economic globalization, which was probably discussed yesterday? Globalized wars, symbolized by the events of 9/11. How have these shaped our understandings about the roots of violence, about identities, about political and economic dispensation in a changed world? The development issues that we used to talk about, the issues of justice, where do they stand? Is development really ultimately a weapon in the hand of imperialism? Has it led us anywhere? These are the kinds of questions we need to raise. And how have we reacted to all this? Do we have a clear position on these issues? Or are we led by the daily and monthly events that change the contours of this conflict? From being viewed as America's war, it is now viewed as an internal conflict. So it has changed in the last few years. Initially, we felt this was America's war being fought. It was about Al-Qaeda. Today, we do not hear about Al-Qaeda, we hear about Taliban. Today we think of it as our war. We somehow have to save our government. We have to talk about the effective rate of government in the frontier, where apparently the provincial government doesn't control, is not in effective control of all the districts. So we want the rate of the state, that big bad state that we hated. That certainly has changed. So the process of internalization of an international event, of seeing someone else's war as our own, is not debated enough, in my opinion. And that has led to a different kind of acceptance of militarization that we were not willing to accept in the 90s. Today, we do not question, or we question very little of what the army does. Military operations are kosher for most of us because there is a psychological comfort in ensuring that the big bad liberal state is there instead of this terrible Taliban state that may get imposed upon us. So in that sense, one hears about how the military has, maybe it had in the past also, but I was reading about it, how there are 52 torture cells or detention centers, one in each cantonment in Pakistan. Do we question that? We accept it. These are run by intelligence agencies. The point is that under the Zia era, we would have made a big hue and cry about this. Today, we somehow feel, let's sweep it under the carpet. We don't want to dig out these skeletons. So even our own reactions have changed. And a point that I will come back to later is our own comfort with one another's notions of what we need to talk about and what we need to avoid questioning, even amongst ourselves. In the past, we were all sort of along the same analysis and so on. Now, whether we question the kind of militarization, I think there's very little of that. But even questioning our own positions within is not very encouraged, which to me is a reflection of this militarized mindset, which does not tolerate dissent. So even within the women's movement, I find increasingly less tolerance for dissent. I know many of you will not agree, and I'm happy to trigger a debate at least. To come back to the war on terror, I've talked about the historical continuities. These are sort of reflected in the discursive representations of Pakistan's tribal areas, with the past as well as that of Swat as a place, it's depicted as a place that was steadily on its way to modernity and so on, and then these bad Taliban came, arrested everything, destroyed schools, the ultimate symbol of modernity, especially girls' education. In both cases, the representations have helped perpetuate the justification for the exercise of violence in these areas without confronting the thorny issues of human rights and structural violence. So structural violence has also taken a back seat because of this war on terror. We do not feel the need to question what is the status of, say, brick-kiln workers or bonded labor and so on, because all these other aspects sort of take over. To continue with the issue of historical continuities, I feel ours are societies that grapple with violence on a day-to-day basis, but we also have intimate histories of violence that form part of our collective memory, because the defining moments in the formation of our identities are ridden with metaphors of violence. So whether we look at 1857, 1947, 1971, 1974 in Balochistan, post-1985 in Sindh, post-9/11 in Frontier, Balochistan to some degree, all of these are are very violent events. So in a sense, when we talk of violence, we need to look at it in its historical depth to understand how our societies have constantly grappled. And what Bush said about the past is dead. The past is not dead for us. And in fact, for me, the birth of 9/11 is very interesting because Afghanistan, where the Cold War ended, Afghanistan is a good metaphor. The Cold War ended over there in terms of the defeat of the USSR, and then the birth of this new world takes place 9/11 with the bombing of Afghanistan again. So for us, even that context is a continuity. And the Taliban that we fear most now, and military operations in frontier, FATA, the justification, and so on, again is embedded in historical constructions that I have talked about earlier, as well as new forms, like I said, our new tolerance for militarized ways of doing things, as well as the military's ability to, and legitimacy. The military has acquired legitimacy to arrest, to kill whoever is perceived to be anti-state. I'm not making a justification for what the Taliban may be doing, but and as Nadish reminded me, the Taliban had a lot of support initially until the Chand Bibi case that happened earlier this year. As well as, Lal Masjid and so on, there was a lot of support for these ideologies. However, there is a swing more recently. However, the swing seems to sort of dehumanize them all, and you can kill basically anyone who's opposing the state and say these are Taliban. Every day I'm reading the news, so many are killed, so many militants, and I keep wondering, were they really militants? How many of them were women? How many were children? We have no idea, and we do not even question these aspects of the military ways of solving issues. So we haven't really formed a collective position on these issues, because we are just so overwhelmed by the idea of a Taliban takeover. In that sense, yes, these new militarized ways of doing things need to be questioned, and that's what I meant by the intensification of Hamara Rona Dhona from 15 years ago. Now we've become at some level insensitive to some of the issues and accept them as natural and as givens. Okay, yeah, and I've talked about the heavy casualty rate, the death rates on both sides. We need to raise again and again the issue of the FCR. Although the reform has been announced, it's not getting implemented fast enough. Collective punishment, all that, what that means for women. And what I want to now bring in is taking war from the public into the private sphere has its own repercussions. I know Rakshanda is going to be talking about displacement, but sort of for me, that is a key aspect of how women are affected. In the past, we talked about refugees, Afghan refugees, and so on, and Kashmiri refugees. Now we have tons of people we call displaced. So that has changed. That context has changed. There are, of course, there are issues about the recognition of who is displaced and who is not by the state. So initially, when there were military operations, say in the tribal areas in Waziristan, the government refused to recognize those who were displaced as displaced, and subsequently no one could really help them. The UN and so on could not do much, UNHCR. Balochistan, the government decided to recognize some of the displaced in order to say that these Baloch were fleeing Bhukti's rule and so on, and how bad things were, so some of them were recognized as displaced. So there's a politics to humanitarian aid. But in the similarly frontier in Karachi, the displaced were never recognized. I remember our study where in Karachi, within the city, people kept getting displaced. They moved from, say, Orangi to Baldia. As the conflict would move to different parts of Karachi, people would abandon homes, go from one place to another. Now that is the kind of displacement that was never talked about, but home being very important and homelessness being a horrendous issue for anyone to face. It was really that homelessness that people had to deal with constantly. When the state decides to recognize homelessness and displacement is political, but the point is, for women, this is important. So whether it is the FCR where houses can be raised and collective punishment can take place, or Karachi, where there was constant internal movement within the city, Balochistan, other parts. Those are aspects where women have been deeply involved, and now displacement has taken on sort of very high proportion, and one is told that we have to expect more of this in this country. So what has changed now is also the intensification in terms of numbers of displaced in this country, and also this changed attitude towards the role of the army. In the past, it was only the army that was doing the nasty stuff. Now we have foreign troops joining them, and we have talk about Blackwater or whatever new name it has. You know, it's a strange organization running around in Pakistan. So now what we have are foreign troops also entering Pakistani soil. We are subcontractors for torture also, and all of this is taking place around us without getting questioned. And that's where I feel constantly the internal conflict, external conflict are connected. And of course, the development issues that we were so concerned about have taken a backseat, completely gone out of our radar screens. In addition, one last or maybe second last point I want to raise is the impacts of conflict and articulation of demands. These conflicts have left us, the harsh contours of these conflicts, the harsh realities have left most people inarticulate. So, when we talk of the human security and so on, most of the groups that were powerless are no longer even articulating any position about their demands, what they need and so on, because of this overwhelming threat to the state by the Taliban. So in that sense, the articulation of demand, whether from labor or peasants and so on, minority groups have again, उनके अंदर से ही वो articulation नहीं आ रही है. So even that has stopped, and I feel that is a serious issue. And in a sense, we are becoming passive recipients of a fate that is not for us to inscribe. I mean, we've become so passive, we just feel that there's this fate, it will roll on, whether we do whatever, we can't do anything. And so this mentality of helplessness, of not having a voice or space to voice our demands and ultimately losing voice is an issue that I felt concerned about. Now, in the midst of all this, of course, not everything is that bad. There are some good things in the last 15 years that have happened, and I would like to highlight that women have contributed a lot to the debates. I think the debates have changed in very fundamental ways compared to how we looked at things back in the 90s, where we had to fight for women and including women. Today it's almost automatic. Women are included, women's voices are included. In peace processes, people are talking about women's perspectives in conflicts. In the displaced context, I know that everyone was talking about gender. Of course, that's the other change from women to gender. We are all now gendered, no longer women. But there is an impact on the debate in terms of how things should be conceptualized, how peace can not only be about the military, it has to be peace within, peace in the community, peace in terms of justice for everyone. Those kinds of impacts, I think the women's movement has made. These are issues that are now fairly accepted everywhere, whether due to the pressures from the international feminist or women's movements from within the country at the national level. All of those have made a difference, I think, to how we understand conflict, to how we analyze conflict. I'm on my last page. So women's knowledge, their experience, their voices have made a difference. However, like I said at the beginning, this overall sort of brutality of militarization, although for women it continues to rage in conflict situations, Yet, for the women's movement, I think we need to problematize the women's movement. It is time we started to open up to questioning, to more inclusive ways of doing things, excluding voices that may not agree with our positions or how we may have done things for the last 20 years is not really the right way to go around it. I think we need to be open to debate. And sort of clarify. I know that Nigat has done that on many occasions to differentiate between a feminist women's movement and a liberal, or sometimes I wonder, organic women's movement. Can we deal with that kind of issues and the articulation of those issues? Because many times we are very dismissive of this other liberal women's movement, what their positions may be, and encourage sort of more of the voices to come out, whether from CBOs or other intellectuals there. Everyone's talking about how there's so many other younger women who are there, who are willing, who want to talk, who want to debate, but somehow we've stopped listening. So I'll stop over here.